Welcome to the podcast. I'm Danielle Goodrick, and joining me today I have Tim Jenkins and Ian Castle from Wheelspinner.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Tim and Ian. Hope you're both well today. Thank you for joining us. Tim's career background was in sales as a sales director and now works with procurement teams to help them understand how they're being sold to, and has delivered some skills courses for CIPS over the years. Ian also works at Wheelspinner and has a wealth of experience in helping procurement to understand how to buy professional services and what pitfalls to watch out for. So thank you so much for joining me today, for your time and your insights.
No worries. Thanks very much for having us.
No, it's great to have you on board in a different perspective. So today's podcast, we're going to be focusing mainly on soft skills with emphasis on influencing skills, particularly at senior levels, which are very important for professionals. And we continue to see these skills need to be enhanced as the complex demands on procurement increase. However, in this year's 2020 CIPS salary guide, we report that being seen as a strategic partner to the business is still a challenge in 2020. So influencing suppliers is often the easier part of the process. So how can procurement better communicate, influence, engage stakeholders, change mindsets, and lead change in their organisation? Is the answer to become more salesy? And that leads us to the podcast today and for Tim and Ian's involvement. So we'll be discussing techniques of how procurement can look at storytelling to help with engagement and the importance of soft skills, plus techniques of how to fine-tune your communication skills. So thank you again for joining us. We're so pleased to have you involved on the podcast today and for joining us at the Salary Guide launch event this year and sharing your tips. So I've got a series of questions for you both, just to give a deeper dive into your expertise. So you've both worked with many procurement teams over the years. What would you say is the biggest challenge for procurement internally?
Well, and again, thanks very much for having us. So Ian and I have this discussion quite a lot, actually, because Ian's been working with procurement teams for a longer period than I have, whilst I was actually coming from my sales side. But it does seem as though over the years, the same issue keeps coming up. And that's probably the biggest challenge is really stakeholder engagement. What we tend to find, in fact, every single time we run a training program, is that we'll find the commercial team say, our hands are tied, or we wish that we could better engage with our stakeholders, or we wish our stakeholders would tell us before they start engaging with suppliers. And yet what we hear from stakeholders within the business outside of commercial is that they really just feel like the commercial teams are coming to them from a process perspective. And so as an overall answer to that, I think really that the main challenge is how you then move from process to people. What do you think, Ian?
No, I agree entirely, Tim. I think what we see so often, Danielle, is that particularly with complex purchases, complex relationships, internal stakeholders will often have a closer relationship with a supplier than they will with an internal procurement team. And those relationships often can stretch back through many years. So we find that there isn't the right level of engagement, and by the time procurement really get involved, it's too transactional. You know, the best they can hope for is to shave a few % off a price or perhaps tighten up one or two deliverables, but they're not there at the right time. They're not at the table in a peer-peer relationship all of the time. And that creates clearly a huge challenge for the function.
It's really been, hasn't it? It seems as though, procurement they spent an awful lot of time in terms of improving process and making sure suppliers have right gateways to go through and making sure that everybody conforms to that. Whereas actually, I think what's perhaps been lost is really understanding that all interactions, whether they be internal or external, are about one human being interacting with another.
Yeah. We're all selling all of the time.
Yeah.
That's very true. And do you think that this challenge has changed over the years? Have you seen things evolve, either get better or worse, or where do you think the challenge still lies?
Well, it's a good question, Danielle. And I do think that over the years there have been changes. There is no doubt that procurement has improved its professionalism as a function. CIPS, of course, has a great deal to do with that. They have worked very hard to improve process in organisations, in governance, to try and get themselves to stakeholders at the right time. There's a wealth of data available to us that we can analyze or that we can purchase from research organizations. But the problem I see, the ongoing challenge still is the relationship is so important to address. And what I see so often in clients I work with is that as professionalism improves, suppliers know that they just need to be compliant now in the procurement process through that procurement life cycle. Because unfortunately, once the contract is won and the relationship starts, the work starts, if there's often little or no contract management, and suppliers know that really anything they've given away in that procurement process, they can get it all back later on, and they can start to control the relationship. Of course, they have very good strategies for that. That's their business. And you start to ask yourself the question, really, who's shaping the agenda here? Who really is in control? So yes, a big increase in professionalism, huge improvements in process, but the other side of the coin is high levels of supplier compliance, because they know that they can get it all back later on in the relationship.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ian. And if you also look at it, I think from certainly over the last sort of 15 years, procurement's really been trying to find its own identity. There's still teams that you've got procurement reporting into finance, and some are reporting into supply chain, and others are not reporting into anybody. They have different names, from commercial to procurement, etc. So I think in terms of trying to define their own identity, there has been an issue. But what has changed has really been the fact that, up until sort of 2008, 2009, it was about get price down, get price down, get price down. Yeah. But I think both across public and private sector, when people started realizing that it was more about value over the lifetime of the contract, and people understanding different stakeholders' perspectives of value, what procurement and commercial started to realize more was that the importance of those soft skills, those relationships with suppliers, was actually really, really important. And now, Ian and I have seen some great case studies of this being done really, really well.
We have. I think when you look at mature organizations, they're focused on outcomes. Suppliers are focused on outcomes. The stakeholders are focused on outcomes. And that's where you want to be. It isn't just about driving down price. It's understanding, as a procurement professional, as an internal stakeholder and client, just how strong a position you are often in to get whatever it is you want. It might be price, but it might be more secure delivery. It might be better deliverables on time. Whatever it is, you can get it if you manage the relationship well and you are that mature buyer and internal stakeholder.
And managing that relationship's key. And we've talked about that for a number of years in terms of soft skills being important. But what soft skills have you seen evolve, and where would you say procurement need to focus on for the future in terms of getting at the real value?
I think a lot of it is, and we see this happening an awful lot, is that it's about people recognizing how they themselves come across and how they interact. Certainly with the procurement individuals that I deal with as clients, they treat me with the same respect as a peer as they would internally, rather than as a sort of a salesperson who might be trying to sort of, pull one over on them. And I think that world is changing quite a lot. Again, linking back to the fact that it's not just about hammering price down now, it's about trying to get best value. If you look at an awful lot of suppliers' relationships now with organizations, they talk about partnership, collaboration charters, trying to innovate together to be able to come up with, great new insights and solve problems. And that working together is extremely important. To do that, you need to have the soft skills where you both realize that you may have different personality types, but ultimately, if you can be transparent with each other as much as you can in terms of information, but then you also realize that having a basic relationship where you can get on and work together for that outcome is really, really important.
Yeah, I agree, Tim. I mean, what I think, Danielle, it is about putting yourself in the shoes of the supplier. It's about putting yourself in the shoes of your internal client, and thinking about the relationship not from where you sit, but from where they stand. And you start to understand, what is it that keeps them awake at night? What is it that they really need help from me? And it isn't going to be, what keeps them awake at night is not likely to be your procurement process and at what step you are in that process. It's going to be about far bigger things than that. And this is where I say procurement often are in such a strong position to make positive contributions to helping people. But you've got to put yourself into people's shoes and understand what it is that's concerning them, what their priorities are. And if you can show that you are listening, that you're interested, and that you're able to add value to their problems, you're halfway there. You're going to have a far better conversation.
I guess trust forms an element of that as well, isn't it? It's getting over that hurdle of being able to kind of trust them, that they have the best intentions and that you are working together on the same common goals. So I think that's probably a hurdle as well, I would say. So you've worked with lots of organisations. Can you give an example of where an organisation perhaps struggled influencing internally, and what were they doing wrong, and what did you suggest to them?
Okay, well, just very quickly, Danielle, to go back to your point about trust, because I think the point you made there is really, really important. You know, if you look at things from a sales perspective, if you're looking at any kind of complex purchase, even in your personal or your professional life, essentially you're not going to buy off that person unless you have a level of trust with them. And whether you like it or not, you'll only trust somebody if you like them, and you'll only like them if you can find some sort of commonality between the two of you. And actually, Ian and I talk about this an awful lot when we're running our training programs. In fact, we ask the question, can real trust ever exist between a buyer and a salesperson? And it's very, very interesting to kind of hear those conversations. And for anyone who's listening to this, who runs a procurement team, I think it's a really pertinent question to ask and to try and debate with your teams, you know, as to real trust and whether it can exist and how important that trust is. To go into an example of an organization who struggled, I won't just give one. I'm going to say about really where I've seen lots and lots of procurement teams trying to struggle internally. And the biggest sort of reason that they were struggling to influence was because of the tone that they used to work internally. There is a model based out of psychology, actually comes from couples counseling, where it talks about how human beings interact with others, where you have a parent, adult, and child. So you can have parent-parent conversations, adult, or child-child. Now, it's very, very interesting that most of the ways in which we see procurement teams communicate with their stakeholders, they come at it from a very parental perspective in terms of the tone. Most of it's done by email. It's not done face-to-face, so you can't use tonality of voice. The very fact that it's written in email means that, very, very sadly, for some reason, unbeknownst to Ian and I, Daniel, you know, you and I could have a normal conversation as we are today. But if we were to start emailing each other, we'd both turn into pretty bad Downton Abbey script writers. You know, and what I mean by this is, you know, I've never turned to Ian and said, you know, Ian, I've run out of coffee, hence I must go to Tesco's. You know, I've never turned to my son and said, you know, Hugo, go and have a shower. Furthermore, I require you to clean your room. You know,
kind regards.
Yeah, and I've certainly never left Ian in a pub and gone, kind regards, Ian, because it's just weird, right? And so you see these emails coming out from procurement where they've been, you know, it's very process driven because it has to be, okay, but the tone, it's sort of henceforth on thou shalt be required on by the 19th underlined bold exclamation mark, and so it comes across in a very parental and actually often passive aggressive way. Now the problem is that then when you come across with that tone via email, the only type of reaction you will get from your stakeholder is that of a child response. And that's not saying stakeholders are childish, it's just that's how human beings interact. So you're not having an adult conversation. And so an awful lot of the work that Ian and I do now is how do procurement teams have adult conversations to elicit adult responses from their stakeholders, putting positive marketing messages together and actually doing it face-to-face or using, you know, calls, so you can actually add tonality into it to try and get rid of that block.
Absolutely. I think it's so important, Danielle, to pick the phone up. You know, you talked in the last question a little bit about trust, and, you know, how do we build trust? It's to get to know people, it's to talk to them. And we're so used to dealing with too much by email, and I think as Tim says, thinking about tonality, preparing, thinking about ourselves in procurement as salespeople in a way, and thinking of every interaction we have with another, being almost like a selling opportunity, preparing for everything. I worry when I talk to procurement teams about meetings they're having with suppliers, and we talk about the research that suppliers do. And you'll talk to procurement people, they won't even look at LinkedIn to see who they're meeting because they don't want that person to see they've been looking. You're thinking, come on, you're professionals. You want people to see that you're taking that relationship seriously and you're using all of these things that are at your fingertips to improve your ability to start to add value to that relationship. So Tim's absolutely spot on with what he says. And I think, take that one step further. Think about this whole issue of trust, of rapport. It's a long process. You've got to talk to people, you've got to get to know them, and you've got to use all of the levers that are at your fingertips.
Oh, that's really interesting what you talked about the adult to adult conversations and how you actually engage. And when you've been in situations where people have spoken to you and they've asked you in a way, like an authoritative way, like you've talked about, and it kind of gets you back up a little bit. So why would you do that to somebody else? So I totally get where you're coming from in that respect. There's a way of asking people to do things and engage, and sometimes it takes a bit of time before you ask the question, I would say, and build that rapport up before you actually lead into it.
Absolutely. And Ian and I often joke quite a lot because we're both sort of quite keen cyclists. We both got to that middle age now where we realize that no one looks good in Lycra, so we can go out on bikes because it's the only way to protect our knees. And we both have the conversation about parent, adult, child. And the example that we give in our workshops is that from an adult perspective, a normal adult conversation, would be, if one of our partners turned to us and said, look, when you get back from cycling, it just really, really gets my goat that you leave your sweaty cycling gear by the side of the wash basket rather than putting it in, and that's an adult, perspective, which would then elicit an adult response. But we don't get that. What we get is, oh, I see you left your cycling gear by the side of the washing basket again, dear. Or, oh, I don't even know why we have a dishwasher when you leave the bowl on top of the surface. And it's that kind of parental tone that gets taken that then does sort of elicit those childlike responses. And it is, you can literally directly take that and then put that into the procurement stakeholder conversation.
Definitely. And having a deeper understanding of the objective and what you're trying to get to as well. I don't know if you've seen that with some organizations you've worked with. People have taken the time to get their stakeholders engaged a lot more in terms of where they're going and why they're doing it, and they're not just being obstructive or trying to change what they do. It's actually for a specific reason that will help the organization. So going on to some examples of some positive things where an organization's perhaps turned something around and what they did to turn things around internally and what the results were.
Yeah, so Ian and I did some work last year with an organisation. Obviously, we can't name them for the purpose of this podcast, but we did some work with them to totally and utterly change the way in which they were interacting with stakeholders. And what they actually did is they launched a campaign over 6 months, which was an internal marketing campaign. So it was run in the same way you'd run a marketing campaign out to your customer base. And it was when the procurement team really started seeing their stakeholders as customers, and they put a whole communication plan together that was all based around having adult conversations face to face or over the phone, so you could actually add tonality into it, to do exactly as you said, Danielle, is actually to go out, engage with the business, and actually say, look, we're actually here to make sure that we can help you get the organization the best outcome. And because they actually put a full, it's difficult because they were short on resource and short on time, as all procurement teams are, but they took time to sit around together and work out a proper comms plan and a positive marketing message to take out to their entire business. And off the back of that, they now have huge amounts of stakeholder engagement, with stakeholders calling them way in advance, as soon as they understand they might have a challenge or an issue in the business, and actually wanting to engage with that commercial department. And they're one of maybe 2 or 3 organizations that Ian and I have seen over the last few years that have actually said, we are actually going to put a proper marketing campaign together to be able to help define ourselves as a function, because an awful lot of, if you poll an awful lot of stakeholders, they don't actually really necessarily fully understand what procurement do. And then actually showing them all the benefits of actually being able to work with them. So going back to your question earlier as to, do we need to be slightly more salesy? Yeah, more salesy and more marketing-y, if that's even a phrase.
Absolutely, Tim. You know, some of the work that Tim and I do, Danielle, is sometimes titled The Art and Science of Selling, and it's just as appropriate for procurement people to understand how they can build influence and sell within the organization, and use very complex techniques of things like consultative selling to improve their relationships with stakeholders. And if you think about consultative selling, and what you're really doing there as a salesperson is you're engaging in a conversation with a stakeholder, with a client, to help take them through a process where they start to express their needs. And you start through that to allowing them actually to often discover what they need themselves. And actually making a sale at that point is not important, because you've already increased your credibility, your status, your standing with that client. And that's exactly what procurement need to do. By speaking to people, by engaging, as Tim has said, through some organized program, what you start to do is, we have finite resources in procurement. We can't be involved in every transaction. We don't need to be. But where there is high risk, where there's complexity, those are the things we need to know about early, where we can start to really add value and ensure that outcomes are protected. And through just that program that Tim says, you start to build those relationships where you are engaged at the appropriate time. You're not just there at the end to shave 2 or 3% off the bill, but you're actually there to help shape the outcomes and really be part of the program team.
And that early engagement, Ian, is something that comes up every year when we do our research. So I think the strategic, being seen as a strategic partner, but the early engagement in projects and things is still an issue for procurement. So you're absolutely right there, in terms of really focusing on building a relationship, having a plan. I think that that's some good advice there. In terms of plan it like you would external comms, you need to do that internally. And I think once you get a few quick wins under your belt as well, and people see where you can add value, then they will start to break down barriers and trust. Yeah. So I don't know if I've got that right, but that's where I see it from what you're saying and your experience.
It's challenging. You're absolutely right, Danielle. It isn't easy. It takes time, which is why it comes up year after year. But the time to start is now. The methods are there, the tools are there to help people be equipped with the right skills to start to address this. And you know, you see salespeople have so many more times the investment in their skills when it comes to sales training. We do need to develop the capabilities of our procurement communities, there is no doubt, and to really educate them in this particular area with how they can start to apply tools, build those relationships, and use some of the techniques that are available to salespeople in the development of their own relationship with their internal clients. It makes a huge difference, and you get engaged early enough, and you get engaged on the projects that are important.
Definitely. And I think mapping those stakeholders early on, like you say, and who are the critical ones and how you align your behaviour to them, and what's the most appropriate plan of action, who's the most appropriate person, kind of matching personality types and things like that. I suppose that all helps in the process as well.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, storytelling then. I'm really interested to know a bit more about this and how you believe you could use this to sell procurement internally, and encompassing what we've already talked about, and engaging stakeholders along the procurement journey. So what would you suggest to people?
I think storytelling is such an interesting area. You know, you think about the work that we do. When we're successful, it isn't because we've been trained to train. It's because we can share experiences with people that are real. We can say, we know this happens because we've done it to you. And if we were in this situation, this is what we would do. This is what we've done. It brings things to life. It builds credibility. So that's such an important thing, I think, for procurement. We have our war wounds. We have our experiences. But actually, it's very important to learn from those, so that we can start to apply those to conversations that we have with our internal stakeholders and with suppliers. It builds rapport, it builds critically that credibility, and you start to get shared back storytelling. You know, this is such an important way to build rapport and to build, as I say, credibility.
Yeah, and I think from it's really about also the fact, if you look deep down into sort of human psychology, people buy emotively, both in their personal lives and their professional lives. You can't help that. You're a human being. And storytelling helps to bring out emotion. You know, if you take an example of buying a car, for example, you know, and I take this with a slight pinch of salt, but, you know, you don't go into a car showroom and have the car salesperson turn to you and say, these are the windscreen wipers and these are how these work, and this is the door and this is how it opens and shuts, and this is the engine and this is how. They don't do that. What they do is they paint a picture and they storytell. They ask you to imagine being on the open road. They ask you to imagine, you know, if it's convertible, the wind going through your hair. You know, if you look at any advert for a car on TV, it's all there to elicit emotion, and it tells a story. It takes the prospective owner on a journey, and therefore, you know, so it makes you feel, you know, the hairs on the back of the neck go up, or elicit some sort of emotive response, rather than a sort of very dull technical set of specifications, which is really not going to work at all. And therefore, you know, certainly from a sales perspective, when I used to train salespeople and we had to cold call people over the phone and sell event sponsorship, we wouldn't do that by saying to them, this is the event and these are the benefits you get. What we'd do is we'd ask them to imagine being there on the day, imagine being surrounded by their customers, imagine the fact that you've got these people walking from into your session, seeing you up on stage. And then by taking them on that storytelling journey, it was much more successful than just trying to give them a list of bullet pointed facts. And I think if procurement can then take that and actually start applying it to how they then work with their stakeholders, telling them to say, look, you know, imagine the fact that we're, you know, 6 months down the line, and actually, because we've worked together, we've managed to get a really, really great specification. And, you know, if something comes up, instead of you having to drop everything and trying to deal with it, you're able to just pick up the phone to us and allow us to be able to handle that for you. And you have the confidence to be able to do that. That's storytelling. That's using effective salesmanship to build that relationship internally. And I think that is a way to be able to change up the parent-child conversation to adult-adult relationships that allow for better outcomes.
Yeah, it's a world apart, Danielle, from the world of emailing an internal stakeholder a specification template and saying, do you mind filling this in for me and sending it back by the end of the week. It really is about understanding what the outcome will feel like, because that really does help contribute to service level design, to key performance indicators, these things that sound easy but are so difficult. And if you can engage with a stakeholder through storytelling and other techniques and really draw out what it is they want and what it will feel like to achieve that success and see those outcomes, you're going to really contribute to that process. And critically, you've got a better chance of having a contract which is operable, so that when it does pass across to the user, the contract management aspect should be more successful. So it sounds a small thing, storytelling, it's a small technique, but applied well, it can have a really big impact on outcomes and success.
Yeah, it can have a massive impact. And I think, like you've talked about, the selling that outcome and what it could look like is key, really, because if you can solve the pain points or the problems or save that person time, but ultimately you need their support over this period to get it right, I think that's so powerful. So yeah, really interesting. Thank you. I hope lots of people start to think about this a lot differently after hearing this today, and taking a little bit of a step back. Everybody's busy, we have kind of tight resources and deliverables, but if you do take a bit of a step back to reflect on effectively what you could do better and where there potentially could be small changes, I think people could start to see some real successes there. So thank you for that. We talked about building relationships, particularly with suppliers and internally. So where have you seen the most positive relationship and the benefits achieved as a result?
I think really it's a difficult one to say, is it really with suppliers or is it with internal stakeholders? I think certainly from our perspective, probably the most positive has been where we've seen commercial and procurement teams starting to build those better relationships with the stakeholders, because ultimately for you to be able to then have the great relationship with supplier to partner, collaborate, innovate together, you've got to have, you know, your internal teams talking properly first, because otherwise, and this may cause some disagreement, I suppose, from listeners, but ultimately, if we can find that there is one hand is not necessarily talking to the other with an organization, an awful lot of the time that can be exploited. And that can be exploited to the supplier's gain, and sadly to, you know, to the procurement and to the stakeholders' organization's detriment. And so I think if any procurement team are going to look at where they need to build the relationships first, it is you need to get your own house in order before you then start trying to work out how to build a better relationship with your suppliers.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Great, thank you both so much for that. I think, yes, some great tips in terms of look at in-house, look to build those relationships and those solid foundations, have the trust, and also make sure you're going out to the market in as one, so that you're seen kind of as the decision maker as well, and you know that you've got the backing internally. I think so many times we see the greatest procurement exercise done, or people think the best contract's been done, but then internally when they take it back to the business, either they can't implement it, or like you say, it's not followed through. So there are kind of big gaps there that could be worked on. So to conclude today then, what would be your top 5 tips for procurement looking to increase their internal influence and be seen as a true value driver?
I think the tips that we have, Danielle, they really do just reinforce what we've already talked about on the call on the podcast today. So the first one would be focus on people, don't just focus on process.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you are then doing that, focusing on people, not just process, really think about your tone of communication. Think about it by putting yourself into the shoes of the person you're trying to communicate with. There's a lady called Lee Ashton. She wrote a book called I Sell, How to Unlock Your Winning Sales Mentality. And in there's a fantastic quote that says, every time you interact with somebody, it's an experience for them. What do you want that experience to be? Because when you interact with someone, whether it be a phone call, email, voicemail, just bumping into them in the corridor, you're giving somebody as an experience of you. And that can only be positive or negative. And if you want to persuade, or in some cases influence people, you can only do that by giving people positive experiences. And so if you're going to send that email, or you're going to go into a difficult meeting, just try and think, if I was being approached in this way, how would I take it?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are thinking about how you come across, what that will require you to be is adaptable, to adapt your communication, to perhaps adapt your behavior, your style, and to do that because you are putting yourself in the feet of that stakeholder. Very important to do.
And I think really just as a final point, it's really something that from a sales perspective, probably the biggest difference that we see between procurement people and salespeople is that, and where I think a lot of value is being lost in procurement for where people are trying to get the best outcomes, is that from sales in day one, you are taught if somebody asks you for something, if somebody wants a discount, etc., you get something in return for it. Whereas what we tend to find is that with procurement teams, an awful lot of the time, they will just give it away, whether it be use of a logo, whether it be a testimonial, whether it be having someone come speak at a conference, and they'll never ask for something in return. So I think as a final point from Ian and I, it would be, if a supplier wants something from you, make sure you get something in return, because there's no way they'd have it the other way around.
No, we call it tradables, and it is so important not to give anything away without getting something back, and realizing what a strong position we are actually in often as procurement to get those things that we want, to get those things that we need. So understand your stakeholder, understand your supplier, and think about what those small tradables might be. Very important.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's so refreshing to have a different perspective than we've seen. We just have procurement people talking to procurement people all the time. So I think the sales insight, like you've said, and where their focus areas are, there's some real learnings there to get a deeper dive into what can be done next to improve and ultimately improve procurement's influence internally. So thank you for today, both of you. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the podcast today and have taken away lots of tips and insights from Tim and Ian. If you want to subscribe to our podcast channel, you can do that at cips.org/knowledge. Thank you again, Ian and Tim, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks very much, Danielle.
Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.